Hello BookTube, my name is Elizabeth. Welcome or welcome back to my channel, Book as in Books. In this video, I'm going to summarize my entire year of reading by nominating the best and worst books that I've read in 2024. But before I name the best and worst books overall, I'm going to start with some honorable mentions, I guess. Books that I want to mention in some categories, but that don't make it to the top 3-5 of best or worst books that I've read this year. I made up the categories. They're just fun categories, I think. For example, in the best books, or worst books, I did not include any romance because in my opinion, romance is a bit apart. So, and they sort of all melt together because I read a lot of Regency romance and they very much look like one another. And at the end of the year, sometimes I have a hard time distinguishing one from another. So I believe that the romance that stands out the most is worthy of a mention. And the book that wins that award is Marrying the Royal Marine by Carla Kelly. So this one is a Harlequin historical from June 2010, and I read that early in the year. And the reason it stands out is that it is set actually in the war, during the war, in the peninsula, in Portugal. So most Regency romance are set during the Regency, during the wars against Napoleon, and the war is mentioned sometimes once in a while in the background because somebody's back from the war, because a brother is in the war or something like that. But this one actually is set in the war, in the war theater. So that makes this book stand out among all the Regency romance that I read. So it's worth a mention. Also not in the best or worst category overall are mysteries. So best mystery I read this year, it is the Second Brother Cadfael Chronicle, which is One Corpse Too Many by Ellis Peters. I love that series. So this is the second, but it's not the second book that I read in that series. I think it's the 8th, something like that. So I've read quite a few. I figured out who the guilty party was rather soon, but with Ellis Peters, it's not always the point. With Brother Cadfael, you just want to spend time with him, and the atmosphere of the Middle Ages is well recreated. In this book, we are in the middle of the Civil War. The city of Shrewsbury has been under siege for a little while, and then the siege ends at the beginning of the book. And of course, many people are hanged because they rebelled against their king, and there is one corpse too many. And that is the mystery that Brother Cadfael has to elucidate. Who is that extra body and how come he was killed? He was with the others. So it's an excellent mystery. Another category, I don't have any book for that. It is Best Reading Experience. And I would give that award to the reading of Pride and Prejudice that Steve Donahue did. Chapter by chapter, he read Pride and Prejudice on his channel and commented. And it was the comments and the exchange with other commenters in the comment boxes that was so interesting. And it's only because Steve mentioned it that I realized how much Mr. Darcy is present in every chapter, even in the chapters where he's not. He's always, always there. From the moment that Elizabeth Bennet meets Mr. Darcy, there's not a chapter that goes by without her thinking about him. And I had never realized that. So that was an awesome reading experience. I'm going to leave a link in the description box to the first of the videos, and then I assume that there will be a playlist of some sort, or if not, I'm sure the algorithm will figure it out and will suggest you the next one and the next one and the next one, and it's very addictive. So that was a wonderful reading experience in 2024. A genre that I claim not to like, but that I end up reading a lot, is memoir. So best memoir of the year is In Other Words by Jhumpa Lahiri. This is a translation. The name of the translator is not on the cover because this author is American. She grew her own, no, it's not true. It's not the only language that she speaks because her parents spoke, if I remember correctly, it's Bengali. Is it Bengali or Hindi? Anyway, her parents spoke a language from India, and she grew up speaking that language and going to school in English. And for some reason, she fell in love with Italian, and she decided to move to Rome with her family to learn Italian correctly, and she decides basically in this book to become an Italian writer. She writes her memoir in Italian. So it's a memoir of learning a language, of living abroad, of identity, and of a whole bunch of things. It was super interesting. It was very short, but it was very, very good. The next category is the book that I read in French that is not translated in English and that deserves the most to be translated in English or in many other languages because it's so good. It is Manuel de la vie sauvage by Jean-Philippe Guérard. Now I'm thinking his parents did him no help in becoming an international star by naming him like that. I can see that it's impronounceable by anyone other than people who speak French. But this book is about a young man who decides that he will be successful in life, and successful meaning making a lot of money. However, he has examples in front of him that he doesn't want to follow. For example, his father had a good business, but he doesn't want to be like his father. And also, one of the first job that he had when he was a student at university was for a man who was rather rich and was exploiting poor people by being the owner of buildings that were completely decrepit and renting apartments in these decrepit buildings and basically exploiting the people who were in tough situations. So he had these examples in front of him and he did not want to be like that. With that, there's also the background of social media and the background of software, of artificial intelligence softwares coming up. So that was just brilliant. It's the second book by this author that I read. In both cases, the same kind of themes are explored, the themes of success of young men with a lot of ambition who are suffering from the mental strain of that and who perhaps are not necessarily following the best examples. And anyway, it is wonderful and it should be translated in English. The next category is the best villain. I read quite a bit of romance, and not in every romance, but it happens once in a while that there is a villain in these books, and they tend to be over-the-top villains, like with a cape and twirling mustache and almost like that. And there was one that was a wonderful, wonderful villain. Wonderful in the sense that's really horrible. And I guess that is what makes him so scary, is that I know that people like that exist in real life. It is, his name was Kingston Gore, the Marquis of Cosgrove. And it is in the book Always a Scoundrel by Suzanne Enoch. And that is a very, very good villain. I'm not telling you how he's a villain. He's engaged to the female main character of the book, and of course the female main character does not want to marry the villain, but she sort of has to, and she will enlist the help of a scoundrel to go through all that. Next category is not quite best villain, but how did I name it? I named it Most Annoying Hero, and that is in a non-fiction. I reread this book. In French, it's Aventures en Guyane. It was translated way back when it was published in 1950 something. The title in English is Journey Without Return, and this is a diary. So the author, Raymond Mauffrais, was a young man who found himself a bit bored after the war because he is from France, and during World War II he was part of the resistance, and not a last-minute resistor who in July 1945, not 45, but July 1944, decided that the Americans were too close and changed side. He was really on the resistance side for the entire duration of the war. He was just a teenager, so there was not much that he did, but he did what he could, and he participated in the liberation of the city of Toulon. And anyway, after the war, he found his life rather boring, and he decided to become an explorer and an adventurer, and he decided to walk on foot the what was then an unexplored region that was bordering the country of Guyana and Brazil, and he wanted to walk over these mountains. Now, at the time, as I said, it was somewhat unexplored. Of course, indigenous people lived there, but for European, it didn't quite exist because it was not the mountains were not measured, and there was no highway there, and it was a bit an unexplored region, and he wanted to be the first to go there. And he had no particular aptitude for that. He had never really practiced that. And when I talked of the book in the spring, I talked of Darwin Award because he died trying to do that. And in his journal, we can see how desperate he becomes and how delusional about his aptitudes he becomes. Oh, I'm going to be the greatest. I'm not turning back. Everybody's saying that I'm an idiot, but no, I'm going to continue. And I'm just going to, I know that I'm strong. I know that I can do it. And I was shouting at him, not in real life, but in my mind when I was reading it, I was shouting at him like everyone else, turn back, you idiot! And of course he doesn't turn back. So what happens is that he doesn't, he never even leaves the last known place by European men. So the unexplored regions, he does not even reach that. An indigenous person found his stuff and his papers at his last place of camping, of his last camp, and he brought it back. He took the papers and brought it back to the nearest mission, and the missionary there read the documents and figured out, oh, he's in trouble, and called for help. There was a bit of research, but it was months and months after his last entry, so it was quite obvious that he was dead by then. But anyway, it's still gripping. It's a reread. I know how it ends. It's non-fiction. I know how it ends, but it was still very gripping. And the hero is an idiot, and he's annoying for that. It's such a wasted life. So that's the award for most annoying hero. Next award, book that made me Google the most, and that is The Underworld by Susan Casey. And this is a gorgeous cover. I did not have that cover when I read the book. It was a book that I borrowed from the library. So this is a book that I read for the BookTube prize, and it's about, as the title says, the underworld. It's about journeys to the depth of the oceans. And the reason I Googled so much is that, of course, there are descriptions of the nature under the water, of various kinds of fish and of various kinds of plants, or I don't know if they're plants or animals or corals or whatnot. And I wanted to see that. So of course there were picture inserts in the book, and there were a few of the animals mentioned were there, but not all of them. So I just kept Googling everything that Susan Casey mentioned, and it was wonderful. And it had sort of a side effect that it made me want to read another book that I had on my shelves and had been having, is that a word, on my shelves for such a long time, and that I had never read. And that is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And that book gets the award for, why did I wait so long to read that book? I've had that book on my shelf since I was a teenager. I don't know exactly how old I was when I bought this, but I know that I bought this at the library sale of my local, the town where I grew up. And I did not attend many library sales after I got to university, so I know that I was a teenager when I bought this. Whether I was in high school or college, I don't know exactly, but one of the two. So I was 18 at the most when I bought this. And it remained unread on my shelves for, since until December. It was unread on my shelves for 30 years almost. So yeah, why did I wait so long to read it? And it's just a wonderful book. I would have liked an edition with footnotes because, of course, this is a fantasy book for the time it was published, which was in the 1860s, I think, 1865, 8, something like that. However, I'm wondering how much of Verne's prediction came true. How much of what he surmised was just a few decades away from being realized, or what was complete fiction, because I know some of the creatures that he describes are complete fiction, and the way that people walk under the sea, like there's nothing there, like they are walking on a plane. I know that's not possible, but nevertheless, it was awesome. And why did I wait so long to read this? The next award is for the reread that brought me the most joy, and that is, again, a book that I read for the first time 30 years ago, not quite 30 years ago, probably 25 years ago, and that is The Scapegoat by Daniel Pénac. So this is the original French version, Au Bonheur des Ogres, but in English the title is The Scapegoat. So this is the story of a man whose job is to be the scapegoat in a general store. So whenever a customer has a complaint about an object that doesn't work, they go to the manager, and the manager asks, who sold you that? Let me check. Oh, it's this man. It's Malocène. And they call the scapegoat to the office, and the manager just gives him a load of crap in front of the customer, and the customer leaves satisfied because the person who sold him this defective object has been punished. So that's his job. Now, of course, one day there's an explosion in the store. A bomb was planted and someone dies, and he's the scapegoat. So of course he's under suspicion, and yeah, he sort of kind of has to solve the mystery, though it's not a mystery. Well, it's a bit of a mystery in there, but it's not a mystery in the sense that well, it's a mystery, I guess it's a mystery, but it's a bit of a whodunit, but it's more a funny book, and it's more a general literature book. Anyway, it's a lot of fun. It's very funny, and I really enjoyed it. There's a bit of oh, anyway, it's awesome. Just read it. It's awesome. And then a category a bit more serious, which is the book that perhaps opened my eyes to a reality I didn't really want to see, and that would be Walking on the Land by Farley Mowat. This book recounts the travels that Farley Mowat did in the 1950s, I believe, in the Great North of Canada, and how Indigenous people were treated back then, and it was just horrible. So that was a very moving book and a heartbreaking book, but absolutely a worthy read. And next, we are finally moving on to the best and worst books. I'm going to start with the worst books because there are fewer of them. In general, I would say that I had an okay reading year. I didn't read a ton of very, very bad books. I didn't read a ton of very, very good books either, I have to say. So I don't have that many books to present, but I nevertheless found books to complain about, because I can complain about books when I want. So I'm going to start with fiction, and the four books I'm going to talk about, they're not bad books in and of themselves. It's because I was disappointed. I had expectations for these books, and the expectations were not met. So the first one's a book in French that is not translated in English. That is Le Premier qui rira by Simon Boulerice. I had heard so much about this author. I know the author a little bit from television and radio. He's a bit of a personality, media personality. And I had read so many people, I had heard so many people talk about the books of this author, and saying that it brought them joy, and they just loved these books and all of that. So I just picked one that looked good and sounded interesting, and I didn't like it. The way it's presented in the back is that it is a trio of three people, of three personalities. The thing is that the book is not constructed that way at all. Yes, we do follow three people, but there's only two people that are sort of, whose story is linked at the beginning. And then the third one shows up just at the very, very end. We follow the third person also throughout the book, but there's no link whatsoever to the story of the first two people. So why do you call it a trio if it's really two person on one side and one person on the other, and just at the very end the story connects? And also the characters, they were well drawn, but they did stuff that was not very palatable, and they were not necessarily likable. So meh. So I was a bit disappointed by that book. It's not an awful book, it's just that I was a bit disappointed. And then the other three books in the worst fiction category all have something in common. At some point during the fall, I don't remember when exactly, Steve Donahue made a video that was in itself a response video to what makes a bad book. And I suggested to the criterias in the comments, adding something else. Another sign that a book is going to be bad is if it's a Jane Austen retelling. And I know that because I can't help it. And I read 3 Jane Austen retelling this year, and all 3 make my worst books of the year list. So it's not because they are bad in and of themselves. Again, it's just some disappointment, because when you say Jane Austen, I expect something, and I'm always disappointed. So the 3 retellings were The Other Bennet Sister by Janice Hadlow. So this book was very popular when it came out in 2020, and I had high expectations for a Jane Austen retelling. And my issue with the book is that in the first part, it's just a sad and lonely retelling of Pride and Prejudice. So it's sad. It's not fun. And then the last part is just a romance. And as a romance, it's only so-so. So that's the reason why I was disappointed. The book doesn't stand on its own. The first part, if you've never read Pride and Prejudice, it's barely understandable and it's not interesting at all. You need to have read Pride and Prejudice for the first part of the book to be somewhat interesting. And then again, it's just a sad and lonely retelling of it, which is not that fun. And then the second part, it's more than 2 parts, but then the last part, which is the romance part, it is, yeah, it's okay, but it's not great. Also in the okay but not great category is Pride and Perjury by Alice McVeigh. It is a collection of short stories based on Jane Austen. They're okay, but nothing more. It's like any Pride and Prejudice retelling, it doesn't stand on its own. You need to have read Pride and Prejudice, or in that case, there's also a couple of 2 or 3 stories about Emma. So you need to have read Jane Austen to enjoy the book or to understand them. And yeah, it's a crutch. It's books that need a crutch to stand, and that's always, it's not to my taste. So I should stop reading Jane Austen retellings. The other one is not quite in the same category. It's not a pure retelling, it's more a spin-off than a retelling. It is The Late Mrs. Willoughby by Claudia Gray. So this is a mystery. I read this is the second in a series. I read the first one, which was The Murder of Mr. Wickham, and I really liked the first one. And the second one, compared to the first, is just not quite as good. So this one stands on its own. You don't necessarily have to read, in this particular case, it would be Sense and Sensibility. You don't have to read Sense and Sensibility to make sense of this book and to understand who the characters are and whatnot. The only character from Jane Austen that appears is Mr. Willoughby. The other characters, I don't think, do we see them? Maybe we do. I barely remember. So it was okay. Nothing more than that. It's just a bit disappointing compared to the first one. So in this case, it's a disappointment not compared to Jane Austen, but compared to the first one in this series. So that concludes the worst fiction. Now for worst non-fiction, I decided to make a top 3, but in fact it's really a top 2. The 2 very, very bad. So the third one that I added to make a top 3, it's a bit unfair. It's Sure, I'll Join Your Cult by Maria Bamford. I read that for the Booktube Prize, and the reason it's there is in the worst book of the year. It's because it shouldn't have been in the Booktube Prize. It's a self-help book, and it received good reviews as a book like that, a sort of funny, humorous self-help book. And it received good reviews for that. And it ended up, because of the good reviews, being nominated in the very long list for the Booktube Prize. So the way it works is that Robert who runs the Booktube Prize, creates a list of, depending on the years, 70 books, 100 books that have received at least 5 rave reviews according to bookmarks on LitHub. I don't know for sure that's the way it works, but it's what I have seen. That's what I have seen. So this book, this nonfiction, received at least 5 rave reviews, so it was in the long list, and people voted for it thinking, this is going to be a good book, I would like to read that, and it ended up on the long list. However, it is not literary nonfiction, so it didn't quite belong in the Booktube Prize. So that's why it was a bit disappointing. It didn't really belong there. But for what it's trying to do, it's doing it very well. So that's the reason why I'm hesitating a little bit in putting it in the worst book. It's a worst book because for me it was not a good reading experience, because I didn't really want to read that book, and it was not, it didn't belong where it was. But for what it's trying to do, it's doing it well. So if you like funny self-help books, you're going to love this book. It's well made. So it's a worst book, but with an asterisk. The other 2 worst books, worst non-fiction, they are, in fact, the worst books that I've read this year. They deserve a rant. So the first one, The number 2 worst book of the year is Serpent in Paradise by D. Berkett. And I've already ranted about that book, so I'm not going to do it again. So I'm going to leave a link in the description box to the video where I rant about this book because it infuriated me. So it started not that bad, and then as you can see, there's almost nothing, no little stickers. And then I started to find some stuff that I didn't like. And at the end, I was fuming. And the problem with the book here is not so much the book itself. The writing and the storytelling is really well done because it got me really, really engaged. The problem is what the author did. This is a travel memoir. So the author, D. Berkett, decided to go to Pitcairn. And this is a very tiny island with a very tiny society of about 3 or 4 dozen people. There's really not that many people living there. So if you just add one person, it changes the dynamic of a lot of things. And she did not take that into account, and she overstayed her welcome, and the way she behaved, yeah, I disagree. I strongly, strongly disagree. So that deserves a 2nd place for the worst book of the year. The actual worst book of the year is Wifedom by Anna Funder. This is another book that I had to read for the BookTube prize. This one is literary. It reads very, very well. It's very, very entertaining, but we have a problem. It's fiction. It's not a book of non-fiction. This book is worthy of a rant, and I've said that I would make a standalone video on that book because it's so bad, it does deserve a standalone bad review. And for people who want to know why Wifedom is bad, and if they happen to Google it or use the search engine on YouTube, they shouldn't have to wait like 25 minutes or more to find the bad review of Wifedom. So if you want to see a rant about a very, very bad book, stay tuned. I'm going to film it right after this, and I'm going to post it the next day that I post this one. So I hope so. For the previous video, I had issues, so hopefully I'm not going to have the same issues. But yeah, stay tuned. I'm not going to do this rant in this video, but there's one coming up. And as I said, my main issue is that this is fiction. It's supposed to be a biography of the wife of George Orwell. So George Orwell, that's a pen name. His real name was Eric Blair. So he married a woman whose name was Eileen O'Shaughnessy, who became Eileen Blair. And the author decides to pluck her from obscurity because apparently she deserves to be put in the light. And the problem is that this woman that she decides to pluck from obscurity and draw the portrait of, she exists in real life, and it's based, the author does research, but the result is an impression of Eileen Orwell. The result is a fictional character. It's not real, and there are several issues in the book, and yeah, it's a bad book. It's a terrible non-fiction. If it was a work of fiction, I wouldn't mind, but it's a work of non-fiction, and it has issues. So stay tuned for the rant. And now that leaves the best books of the year. I'm going to start with the fiction again, because my best and my worst books of the year were non-fiction. So I'm going to start with the fiction, the best fiction, but that's not necessarily the books I love the most. Well, I did love them. So the first one I'm going to talk about is one that I read recently. It's a classic. It is Thérèse Raquin by Émile Zola. So this is an English cover, and I read it in French, of course. So this is one of the first novels that Zola published. It was published in the same year that Crime and Punishment was published. And the reason I'm saying that, Crime and Punishment by Dostoevsky, is that there are similar themes. In this book, we have, at first I had the impression that it would be a sort of Bartleby by Melville. So Bartleby is a man who sort of doesn't exist. And at first, Thérèse Raquin seemed to be a woman that doesn't exist. She exists only through her aunt and her cousin, whom she marries. And then they move to the city. They move to Paris. And then she meets a man, her husband's friend, and they become lovers, and then she has a personality. It's not Bartleby, it's a lot more Raskolnikov. The couple of lovers decide that the husband is standing in the way of their happiness, and they decide to off him, and it's the story of their guilt and of all that. So it has a lot of similarities with Pride and Prejudice, with Crime and Punishment, and it was published the same year. So I very much doubt that one influenced the other. It was just in the zeitgeist, I guess, the type of story that people wanted to read in the 1860s. So this was very good. If you've never read Zola, it would be a good place to start. It's not very long. It's about 200 pages. There are good descriptions of Paris in the 1860s, and it's very, very entertaining and very good. And this is another book that I read relatively recently. It is a novel. The title in English is A Sunday at the Pool in Kigali. It is by Gilles Courtemanche. And as you probably know, Kigali is the capital of Rwanda, and you can probably guess that this is set during the genocide in 1994. So it is the story of a French-Canadian man, a Quebecois, who is working in Rwanda and had been working there for quite a little while. He was making films and he was working for an international organization. And he could witness the crumbling of the situation, but at the same time being sort of a white person who was a bit outside of what was going on. But he had friends, local friends, who would tell him, and it's a love story because he falls in love with a young woman, and the young woman falls back in love with him. And she is a Hutu. So if we go back in 1994, it was a genocide of the Tutsi by the Hutu. So she is Hutu. She is part of the dominating, if I can say, the dominating group. However, she looks like a Tutsi. So for that reason, she's a target. She has papers saying that she's a Hutu, but the papers don't count because she's beautiful and the men will want to rape her. And it's a hard book. It's not easy to read, and there's a lot of tension, and you can see the situation going worse and worse and worse. But it's a type of book that stays with you for a long time, and I know it's going to stay with me for a long time. So that's the reason why it makes my top 5 fiction of the year. It's very, very good. And then the next 2 are kind of the same. It's Gilgamesh, but it's in 2 different translations. So I read 2 translations of Gilgamesh, and both of them are awesome. So this one is by Sophus Helle. It's the first one that I read this year, and this one is a translation in verse. It's a translation in verse, and it is actually a translation because the translator, Sophus Helle, actually can read the cuneiform and the original language, which is rarely the case in translations of Gilgamesh. Most of the time, it is writers in either English or French who read scholarly translation and try to put them together and create a translation in their own language. But in this particular case, Sophus Helle can read the original, and he read the original and he created a translation. And it also comes with a lot of extra material, which is placed at the end, which is kind of nice the way he presents it. He puts at the beginning an introduction, and he says, this is what you need to know before you read Gilgamesh. And it's a short introduction. And what he puts at the end is what is interesting to know. You don't have to read it before. So he decided to put it at the end so that the readers are not put off by all the extra material before the book starts. So I thought that was an interesting way of placing things. And the essays at the end are very good and very interesting. And then this one is a translation. So this is one of the cases where the author does not read the original. So she used various scholarly translation, but not just in English, also in French and in German. And she put all of this together to create a translation of Gilgamesh. And this one happens to be in prose. So if poetry, epic poetry scares you, you can go for this one. So this one is the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it is the translation of N.K. Sanders. So this one is in prose. It's rather short. There is a good introduction that goes with it to explain, if you don't know at all what Gilgamesh is, to situate you a little bit. And it is very, very good too. So this is another very great book. The number 1, so the 4 that I just presented are in no particular order, but I have a number 1 fiction for this year, and it happens to be a reread. It is Les Plouffe. In English, the title is The Plouffe Family. It is by Roger Lemelin. So this book dates from the 1940s. It's an old book, and it's a reread. I read it for the first time about 10 years ago, not quite. I think it was about 10 years ago, 2015, 2014, something like that. And I liked it at the time. I thought it was a good book. And I reread it. and now I think it's a great book. I think it's one of the best books that I've ever read. It's just awesome. It's the story of a family that lives in Quebec City in the 1930s, the very end of the 1930s. It's a working class family, meaning that the father works in a workshop of some sort, and the mother stays at home. There are 4 children. The youngest one is 18 or 19. The youngest one is 19, and the eldest one is 38, and there are 2 in the middle, and everyone is living at home. The mother holds her children, her brood, so tight, closely to her, that the children sort of remain children and cannot really grow up. But at the same time, the mother does not have any freedom in a way. She doesn't have her own space. Even her kitchen is not hers. She can decide nothing. So it's this strange struggle of power between an overbearing mother, but at the same time, a mother who does not have any power. And it's about the French-Canadian society changing. There's a lot of criticism of the church in there. They are mocking the church a little bit. They are mocking certain aspects of society, and it's just funny and brilliant, and I absolutely loved it. In fact, I filmed a video, What a Corker, and I accidentally erased it before I posted it on YouTube. So I could film another one, but it was just an awesome read. I don't know how easily you can find it outside of Canada. In English, I suppose it must be, even in Canada, I suppose it's rather difficult to find in English, but it's so good. It's really, really good, and I recommend it to everyone. So that's my favorite fiction of this year. And then for the favorite non-fiction, you will see that there is quite a lot of variety. So in no particular order, except again for the last 2, which is really a top 2. One book that I really loved was Inside Qatar by John McManus. I classify it in my statistics of the reading of the year. I decided that this was a travel book, but it is in fact a book of anthropology. So the author decides to go to Qatar and tries to make the portrait, to paint a portrait of the country according to the principles of anthropology, trying to meet as many people from as many different castes as he can, and from as many different walks of life as he can. However, the society of Qatar itself makes it very difficult, because this is a strange country where people with the Qatar nationality or a minority, but a really small minority in the population, and they have rights that the other people don't have, and it's a very stratified society with Qatari at the top, and then Western expats in the 2nd place, and then in 3rd place, I don't know exactly who it is, but all the way at the bottom is going to be the domestic workers from Africa or from Nepal or things like that. So it's a fascinating book, and it's a book that made me learn a lot, because I didn't know anything about Qatar, and I was sort of plucked out of my little comfortable Canada and dropped into uncomfortable Qatar. Another book that I did not expect, it was Eve. The subtitle is How the Female Body Drove 200 Million Years of Human Evolution by Kat Bohanon. And this is a book that I read for the BookTube Prize. It's a science book, and the author presents a theory that the evolution of the human being happened mainly because of women's need, because it's the women who needed to adapt more than the men. So the human evolution probably is due to women more than men. So I thought it was a fascinating theory. It was presented in a way that was very interesting and very readable, and it was an awesome book. A history book that I really liked was France on Trial by Julian Jackson. So this is a history book that goes over the trial of Marshal Pétain. So Marshal Pétain was a hero of World War I. He was the winner of Verdun, one of the great battles of World War I for France. But when World War II happened, France was quickly beaten by the Germans and quickly capitulated, and Marshal Pétain was given the powers to negotiate something with Germany. And I don't know if he negotiated it, but he was basically given the job of running France while it was occupied by Germany. So Marshal Pétain was responsible for the southern part of France, which was autonomous, Read very big quotation marks in framing autonomous, because it was at the boot of Germany. But nevertheless, the question became, what was Marshal Pétain's role in the collaboration of France with Germany, with the extermination of Jews, with every bad thing that happened, with the denunciations to the Gestapo, with the torture that happened, with the suspension of human rights, which France pretends to be the mother of all human rights, with the French Revolution of 1789 and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and all of that. But in the land of the Declaration of the Rights of Man in the 1940 to 1944-5-ish, it was not pretty. So Marshal Pétain was arrested and put on trial for collaboration in crimes against humanity and a bunch of things. And this is the story of the trial. So it's fascinating, and it's very interesting, and it's a very important, even though it's relatively short, it's just a few weeks, it is nevertheless an important moment in the history of France. And then another great book that I read because of the BookTube Prize, it was King Alive. So this is a biography of Martin Luther King by Jonathan Eig. And it's a very, very good biography. From the start, the author makes clear that this is not going to be a hagiography. It's not going to be how great Martin Luther King is. Of course, he did great things, and that is included in the book. But also the more human aspects, I'm going to call them that, the less savory aspect of his personality are also presented. And as the author says at the beginning, he interviewed a bunch of people, and it's people who knew Dr. King, but because of the passage of time, perhaps now they were more free to speak what they really think and what really happened, and perhaps things that were better kept secret while certain people were still alive. Now that many years have passed, it's perhaps easier to speak their mind. So there's a lot of new information in that book, and it's very, very good. And then my top two. So there is, again, it's two different types of books, though they have something similar. So there is A Polar Affair by Lloyd Spencer Davis. As you can see, there's a lot of penguins in there. So the author is a specialist of penguins. And he thought he was the first one to observe penguins in Antarctica and present them for what they were. Not the cute little animals who mate for life and live almost a Victorian bourgeois lifestyle. That's fiction. In real life, yes, they mate for life, but not really. So he thought he was the first one to make all these discoveries. And at some point he realized that no, a paper had already been written years and years before, decades before, when there was the race to the South Pole between Amundsen and Scott. There was the Scots party was divided into one party was supposed to go to the South Pole, another party was supposed to explore north. Everything is north when you're in the South Pole. So the northern expedition, and this northern expedition got cut off and couldn't go back to the camp. So they spent the entire winter in a shack, in a horrible little shack, but they survived. And one of the person who was part of that party was a Dr. Murray, George Murray Levick, sorry. He was the physician. So he was the physician, so he was supposed to monitor the human's health, but he also served as sort of the scientist, so the naturalist on board. And during this winter, where everyone was rather bored, he decided to observe the penguins. And Lloyd Spencer Davis decides to investigate who was this George Murray Levick. Why didn't he publish his findings? And what were these findings? So we have a whole bunch of stories in this book. So we have the penguins, we have the life of George Murray Levick, and we also have the race to the South Pole, which is a fascinating story in and of itself. We just have tidbits of it here. It's still satisfying enough, but if you read this, you'll want to read more books about the race to the South Pole. So it's super interesting. It's really well told, and I really enjoyed this book. And I read this book set in Antarctica in the middle of the summer when there was a heat wave outside, and it's excellent to cool yourself, just to read a little bit about Antarctica in the middle of summer. It's really, it's cooling down. It has a cooling effect. So that was a lot of fun. And my other favorite book of the year, because I say favorite nonfiction, but I think it can fit as favorite book. It's a book that I read very early on in the year. It is The Half-Known Life by Pico Iyer. I still don't know how to pronounce the last name of this man. Just before I filmed this, I went on YouTube to try to find someone pronouncing his name, because he gives interviews and he gives conferences and he participates in panels and all of that. And I figured at some point somebody's going to say his name. But no, either the video starts and he's already talking and he doesn't present himself, or the video is an interview with someone who already knows him and just calls him Pico. So I still don't know how to pronounce his last name. So I'm going to go for Iyer, because it seems to be like the most straightforward way to pronounce it. So the subtitle is In Search of Paradise. So this is a travel book, in a sense, but at the same time it's a bit of a religious book. Pico Iyer decides to it's thinking about the notion of paradise. What does paradise mean? So a lot of in paradise on earth, the notion of paradise on earth and the notion of sacred place. So he visits sacred places and places that are considered by some people to be paradise. Most of these places are in Asia. There's one in California, if I remember correctly, but most of them are in Asia. And it's just such a good book. It's a short little thing, about 200 pages. And I think what made it so wonderful is that I was not really expecting the book to be that great. The way I learned of the book's existence, it was because of the BookTube prize. As I said earlier, Robert sends us a list of 70, 80, 100 books that we can vote for that will make the final 48 and will really be contenders for the BookTube prize. And I researched every book on that list to know for which book to vote for. And that one sounded great, so I voted for it, and then I borrowed it at the library and I read it, and it was just awesome. And apparently nobody else voted for it, or not enough people voted for it, because it did not make the final 48. And it's a shame, because it was such a wonderful book. And now that I'm praising it to the rafters, I'm wondering if you go to this book expecting something great, you will be disappointed. Because I think the element of surprise was something, but at the same time, it was a wonderful book. As far as the writing was very interesting. There was an atmosphere to everything that he wrote, and I loved it. I just loved the book. I don't know how to praise it correctly. It's a very good book about the notion of paradise and of sacred place, and I recommend it. I think it's my favorite read of the year. And I don't have a copy of the book, so I really should buy one to make sure that I still have it if I want to reread it in 10 years. Anyway, so that's it for my best and worst books of the year. Again, I was not expecting to make a 45-50 minute video. I always think things are going to be short, but apparently I cannot stop talking. Anyway, I'll put timestamps and you will be able to find whatever you want. Well, if you're hearing me all the way to now, you don't need the timestamps, or you found them already. Anyway, so thank you everyone for watching. That was my 2024 year in reading, and I still have a couple more videos about 2024, 2 or 3, maybe 4. I still have things to say, including a rant on wifedom. So thank you everyone for watching, and I will see you in the next video. À la prochaine!